Okay, so you know how much we all love to just get right to the heart of things right, cut through all the clutter, and really understand something deeply and quickly.
Absolutely. That's what we're all about here.
Right, and today, well, we are going deep on thiamine, vitamin B1.
Thiamine, yeah.
We've got some really cool new research notes, actually.
Yeah.
And they seem to be connecting some dots that I hadn't really considered before.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to weave those together and give you kind of like a much bigger picture of why thiamine is so important.
I think it's going to be a fun one. I think we're going to touch on energy and how thiamine ties into that.
Right. Like how your body makes energy, how it uses energy, all that stuff.
And maybe even some other surprises along the way.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. This is a good one. So we're kind of starting with these research notes, and we're going to see where they take us, and we're going to try to bring it all together for you.
Sounds good.
You know, we all know that thiamine's been around for a while, and we kind of think we know what it does.
Right. The basics. Right.
Right? Like it's good for energy,
Yeah.
and we need it.
Yep.
And but there's a whole lot more going on here. So let's unpack this.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, isn't it? How even a nutrient that's been studied for so long can still reveal these new layers of importance to us.
Totally.
So we kind of all start with this basic understanding, right? That thiamine plays a crucial role in energy production. And that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
And, we know that it's active form thiamine pyrophosphate.
Exactly, is essential for this really vital enzyme complex called the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex.
Right.
And we need this complex to basically turn the fuel we get from our food into usable energy for the cell.
It's that first step. It's like that gatekeeper.
Absolutely. And but what's really interesting is some of these new findings are adding this really cool twist to this like really foundational knowledge that we have.
Right. Because we've always thought, okay, thiamine comes in, it gets changed into TPC, and boom, energy.
Energy.
Yeah.
But one of the notes was talking about how the enzyme that does that changes it,
Right.
which is thiamine pyrophosphate kinase 1, or TPK1.
TPK1.
Yeah, KPK1 has a preference for a different nucleotide, like not ATP.
Isn't that interesting?
It's weird.
Yeah.
So it prefers UDP-uridine 5,5-phosphate.
Precisely. And this was a bit of a surprise for researchers because, as you mentioned, ATP is typically considered like the main energy currency of the cell.
It's the one we always talk about.
Exactly.
It's like the rock star.
Right. And so we're thinking TPK1, this enzyme that activates thiamine, should be using ATP.
Right.
But it turns out, no, it actually has this preference for UTP when it's converting thiamine into its active form, TPP.
So that throws a wrench in things, doesn't it?
It does.
Because even if you're getting plenty of thiamine,
right,
but your UTP levels are low, your body might not be able to actually use it.
Activate it.
And so then that leads to a bigger question, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Like, could this UTP dependence be why some people seem to be thiamine deficient even though they're supplementing?
Right. And it's always been this mystery, right?
Yeah.
Like, why are some people, they're taking thiamine, but they're still showing signs of deficiency?
Yeah.
And this research suggests that, maybe it's not always about just getting enough thiamine in.
Right.
Maybe it's also about the cell's ability to actually process and activate that thiamine. And maybe UTP availability is playing a much bigger role than we realize.
It's like having the ingredients but not being able to turn on the oven.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah. So the key takeaway here is thiamine utilization is not just about how much you consume, but also about these other crucial cellular components like UTP.
Exactly.
And this makes me wonder, like, especially for people who are experiencing persistent low energy, could this be part of the picture?
It's definitely something to consider.
It really is. It really is. And so building on this energy production idea, let's talk about how this same process feeds into creation of acetylcholine,
right,
which is a key neurotransmitter in our nervous system.
Absolutely. And when we start connecting these dots, it becomes clear that thiamine's role in acetylcholine synthesis is actually quite logical.
Yeah.
So we just talked about how active thiamine, this TPP, is essential for the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex.
Right.
And we know that this complex produces acetyl-CoA, which is what? A direct building block for acetylcholine?
There it is.
Right.
There's the connection.
So you can really see this chain reaction happening, right?
Right.
If you have less active thiamine, that could potentially lead to less activity of the PDH complex,
Right.
which means less acetyl-CoA being produced. And ultimately, that could result in a dip in acetylcholine production.
Makes total sense.
Right.
But then the research brings in another character that can throw a wrench in the whole thing. Glycogen synthase, kinase 3 beta.
Ooh, GSK3.
GSK3. Yeah.
It's a mouthful.
It is. It's a mouthful. What is that all about?
So GSK3, it's a mouthful, but it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because what research is showing is that GSK3 actually has this inhibitory effect on the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex.
It's like putting on the brakes.
It's exactly like a dimmer switch. You know, it can either brighten or dim the activity of the PDH complex. And if GSK3 is overactive, it can really dampen down that PDH complex,
Right.
leading to a reduction in that vital acetyl-CoA.
And less acetylcholine.
And consequently suppressing the production of acetylcholine.
So that is being connected to problems in the brain, right? Like with cholinergic deficits.
Absolutely. And, you know, researchers are really starting to highlight this as a potential contributor to those cholinergic deficits that we see in a number of different diseases.
Right. So then you've got this double whammy potential, right? You've got the low thiamine activity, maybe because of UTP limitations.
Right.
And then you've got this GSK3 putting the brakes on the whole process that generates acetylcholine.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us back to that idea of thiamine dependency we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
You know, if you have this overactive GSK3 that's already creating this hurdle for PDH, some individuals might become even more reliant on having sufficient activated thiamine just to keep those acetylcholine levels up to par.
Right.
It's a really delicate balancing act that's going on inside the cell.
It is. It really is. So we've gone from basic, like powering the cell with thiamine to acetylcholine, a major brain chemical.
Right.
And now we're going to talk about something that seems completely different, but it's not.
Right.
It's all connected.
Bear with us.
We're going to talk about folate.
Folate. Yeah.
And how it's actually interacting with thiamine.
This is where it gets really fascinating.
It does.
Because, you know, recent research has revealed this really surprising connection between thiamine and a transporter protein that we typically associate with folate.
Right. That's the thing that throws people off.
It does.
It's like, wait a minute, what?
Exactly. And this really highlights how interconnected everything is in the cell, right?
Right.
So we're talking about the reduced folate carrier 1, or RFC1,
Okay.
which is also known as SLC19A1.
No, it's a mouthful.
It is.
No.
But we typically think of RFC1 as the main gateway for folate to get into our cells.
Right. That's its job.
That's its job.
It lets folate in.
Let's folate in.
Mm-hmm.
But what researchers have found is that it can also transport these phosphorylated forms of thiamine.
Wait a minute. So it's not just letting folate in.
It's not.
It's messing with thiamine, too.
It is. And specifically, it's transporting thiamine pyrophosphate, that TPP we've been talking about.
So the active form of thiamine.
The active form.
Wow.
And what's even more interesting is it's not just transporting it in any direction. It seems to be acting as what's called a TPP antiporter.
An antiporter, what does that even mean?
Okay, so think of RFC1 as this special door in the cell membrane, right?
Okay.
It's not a one-way door. It's a two-way door. And in the case of TPP, it seems like it can actually pump TPP out of the cell.
Out?
Out.
Oh, that's not good.
Well, it's all about balance, right?
Right.
And what's significant is that they found that cells that have more RFC1 expression actually tend to have lower amounts of TPP inside.
That makes sense.
Right.
If it's pumping it out.
Exactly. So this suggests that RFC1 might actually be playing a role in regulating how much active thiamine is inside the cell.
So the more this folate transporter you have, the less thiamine you might have inside the cell.
Potentially.
That's so weird.
It is counterintuitive, especially if you're thinking just about folate.
Right, right.
But when you look at the bigger picture, it's like, oh, there's this interplay going on.
Yeah.
And it gets even more interesting because the research dug deeper and they found that methotrexate.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, methotrexate is a drug that interferes with folate transport via RFC1.
Right.
And it turns out that methotrexate also inhibits the efflux, the outward flow of TPP.
So it's blocking the thiamine from getting pumped out.
It is.
Wow.
And what's even more interesting is that if you go the other way, TPP can competitively inhibit the influx of methotrexate.
So they're both trying to use the same door.
They're both trying to use the same door.
That's wild.
Right. And this really strongly suggests that they're competing for the same binding spot on that RFC1 transporter.
So it's like a biological traffic jam.
It is. It is. It's a really cool way to think about it. And what's even more fascinating is the research indicates that this shared binding site on RFC1 can accommodate both extracellular 5-MTHF,
which is a type of folate.
Which is a key form of folate, exactly, and intracellular TPP.
So both of them are trying to get in and out.
Exactly.
Through the same door.
And this opens up this possibility of a really elegant regulatory mechanism, right? Because now the levels of folate outside the cell could potentially influence the levels of TPP inside the cell and vice versa, all through this competition for RFC1.
That's so cool.
It is. It's like this beautiful example of how the cell is orchestrating the balance of these essential nutrients.
Right. And this has like real world implications, right? Because there's a genetic variation
There is.
in the SLC19A1 gene, RS1051266.
That's the one.
And that has been connected to Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome.
Yeah.
Which is WKS.
WKS.
Which is a condition that's linked to severe thiamine deficiency.
Right. And this is really a critical link because, you know, this particular genetic variant has been previously associated with changes in how folate is transported.
Right.
But what's really new here is that researchers have now found that this same variant also affects TPP efflux.
So how much thiamine gets pumped out.
Exactly. And specifically, they found that under conditions of thiamine deficiency, cells with this variant had significantly less TPP being pumped out compared to cells without it.
Wow.
And this suggests that there's this genetic connection between how our bodies handle folate and how susceptible we might be to these thiamine deficiency related conditions like WKS.
Okay. This is getting so complex.
I know.
In a good way.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
It really is. We've gone from, this basic energy flow idea to acetylcholine in the brain to folate.
Yeah.
And now we're going to talk about NAD plus SO.
NAD plus SO.
Yes. Nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but it's a really important molecule.
It is. It's involved in so many processes in the cell, everything from energy metabolism to DNA repair, you name it. NAD plus is probably involved.
So it's a busy molecule.
It's a busy molecule.
Yeah, so thiamine is also connected to NAD plus some.
It is. It's a bit more of an indirect connection, but it's a crucial one nonetheless.
Okay, so how does that work?
So NAD plus is primarily made through this pathway called the salvage pathway.
Right.
And this pathway uses nicotinamide, or NAM, as its starting material.
Right.
But for this salvage pathway to work, it needs this really important precursor molecule called PRPP.
PRPP, phosphorylysyl pyrophosphate.
You got it.
Yeah.
Now here's where thiamine comes in. PRPP itself is synthesized from a molecule called ribose 5-phosphate.
Okay.
And the availability of ribose 5-phosphate is heavily dependent on this pathway called the pentose phosphate pathway.
Oh, that pathway.
That pathway. And the research notes point out that thiamine deficiency can really put a damper on how quickly our bodies can make new ribose.
So less thiamine, less ribose.
Exactly. And specifically, it affects what's called the non-oxidative branch of the pentose phosphate pathway, which relies on this enzyme called transcatalysis.
Right.
And guess what? Transcatalysis needs thiamine to work properly.
It's thiamine dependent.
It is. It is. So if you don't have enough thiamine, the activity of transcatalysis can get impaired,
right,
which leads to this bottleneck in the production of ribose.
Right. So less ribose.
Less ribose, less PRPP.
Less PRP.
And if PRPP levels are low, then that main salvage pathway for making NAD plus from nicotinamide gets compromised.
So even though you can get NAD plus from like NMN and NR,
right,
which already have a ribose component,
yeah,
the cell's ability to make its own NAD plus from NAM,
right,
that's dependent on thiamine.
It is. Isn't that fascinating?
It is. So that's something to think about if you're trying to boost NAD plus.
Absolutely. And it has particularly important implications for people who might be taking high doses of niacin or nicotinamide to try and boost their NAD plus levels.
Right. Because they could be creating this other deficiency.
Exactly. If their thiamine status isn't optimal, their bodies might not have enough PRPP to effectively utilize all that extra nicotinamide they're taking.
So taking thiamine,
yeah,
when you're doing something like that is probably a good idea.
It's something to consider. It suggests that making sure you have adequate thiamine intake could be a really important part of getting the most out of those NAD plus boosting efforts.
That's a really good point.
Mm.
That's a really good point. Okay, so we've gone through energy, we've gone through neurotransmitters, we've gone through folate, NAD+,
There's a lot of connections.
a lot of connections, and now we're going to talk about infection.
Infection.
And how bacterial infection
Yeah.
can impact how our muscles handle thiamine.
Yeah, this was really unexpected research.
It was.
But it's so fascinating because it shows us how our body's response to fighting off an infection can actually interfere with the way our muscles use and process thiamine.
Yeah, and they were talking about sepsis specifically, right?
So sepsis is basically your body's extreme response to an infection.
Right. It's like the immune system going haywire.
Exactly. And it can be really dangerous,
Right.
life-threatening even. And what they found in these studies is that during sepsis, there's this significant reduction in the uptake of vitamin B1 into muscle cells.
Specifically diaphragm muscle cells.
Specifically diaphragm muscle cells, the muscles that help us breathe.
So important.
So important.
So that's scary.
It is. And they think the main culprit behind this disruption is this thing called toll-like receptor 4, TLR4,
Yeah.
which is basically like this little antenna on the surface of our cells. And its job is to recognize parts of bacteria like lipopolysaccharide or LPS.
It's like the lookout.
It is. It's like, oh, there's bacteria here.
Right.
We need to sound the alarm.
Right. And so it kicks off the immune response.
Exactly. But unfortunately, it seems like this activation of TLR4 can also have this unintended consequence.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it can actually reduce the production of these key thiamine transporter proteins in muscle cells.
The proteins that let thiamine in.
Exactly. Specifically, we're talking about THTR1,
Oh, yeah.
THTR2, and MTPP1.
Okay.
And when the production of these transporters goes down, it basically means those muscle cells can't get as much thiamine as they need.
That's bad news.
Right. And so it's like this defense mechanism that's supposed to be protecting us from infection is actually making it harder for those muscles to function properly.
Especially the diaphragm.
Especially the diaphragm, which is so crucial for breathing.
That's a double whammy right there.
Yeah, it is. And it could explain why we see so much muscle weakness and particularly respiratory problems during these severe infections.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And what's even more interesting is in the lab, when they blocked TLR4,
They blocked it?
They blocked it, and guess what? Thiamine transport went back to normal.
Wow.
So this suggests that maybe if we can target TLR4 or those pathways that get activated downstream, maybe that could be a future strategy for treating these infections and helping to preserve muscle function.
That would be huge.
Wouldn't it?
Especially with things like sepsis.
Especially with sepsis.
Which is so dangerous.
Exactly.
So this is pretty amazing. We've covered so much ground here. We started with just this basic idea of thiamine being important for energy production.
Right.
And we've now talked about how it's involved in neurotransmitter synthesis, how it interacts with folate transport,
Yes.
how it plays a role in NAD+ production, and even how infection can impact thiamine uptake in muscles.
We've come a long way.
It's mind-blowing.
It is. And I think this deep dive really emphasizes that thiamine's importance goes so far beyond just, basic energy metabolism.
It's not just about energy.
It's not just about energy. It's a key player in all these essential processes that keep our bodies healthy and functioning properly.
So the question is,
Yeah.
what other seemingly unrelated health issues might be influenced by our thiamine status?
That's the big question.
That's the big question.
And I think it's a question worth exploring.
I think so too. I think so too. And how could these findings change our approach to nutrition?
You're right.
Not just when we're healthy, but also when we're sick.
Exactly.
Or when we're thinking about, our individual genetic predispositions.
Right, because everybody's a little bit different.
Everybody's a little bit different.
And what works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly.
And so I think this really underscores the importance of personalized medicine and personalized nutrition.
It really does. It really does. It's a lot to think about.
It is. But it's exciting, too.
It is exciting.
Yeah.
Because the more we learn, the more we can empower ourselves
Absolutely.
to take control of our health.
Yeah.
I love it. So for everyone listening, if any of this has resonated with you, if you're curious to learn more,
please do.
Dig into those research notes.
There's so much more detail there.
There's so much more to explore.
Yeah. And you can really tailor your research to whatever aspect of this really caught your interest.
Exactly. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.